The sound of my relatives laughing sliced through the minister's final blessing like glass. I stood frozen at my father's graveside, watching clumps of earth hit the mahogany casket, while my cousin Derek whispered loud enough for half the cemetery to hear. Bet he's already planning which relative to hit up for money next. My hands curled into fists, so tight my knuckles went white. The morning sun felt suddenly cold against my face as more snickers rippled through the group of black-clad vultures surrounding my father's final resting place. My Aunt Patricia dabbed fake tears with a handkerchief while shooting knowing glances at the other family members. My name is Oliver. I'm 29 and a tech entrepreneur. This is the story of how I made them eat every cruel word. The laughter burned worse than grief. While dirt was still falling onto the casket of the man who raised me, they were already dissecting my failures like amateur surgeons. I caught fragments of their whispered conversations floating on the cemetery breeze. 5 years of nothing to show for it. Those ridiculous app ideas. Should have joined the family business like Derek. None of them knew what I'd actually been building in those 5 years of silence. Later that afternoon, back at the family mansion, the vultures circled closer. Crystal glasses clinked with expensive whiskey as my relatives transformed from mourners to gossips in record time. The mahogany-paneled room that used to intimidate me as a child now felt like a stage where I was the unwilling entertainment. "Still living in that studio apartment downtown?" Derek asked, loosening his designer tie. He'd claimed the CEO position of Dad's company the moment the doctors mentioned the word terminal. The golden boy with his MBA and his confidence, everything Dad supposedly wanted in a son. "Someone has to keep the family name respectable," my Uncle Robert added, raising his glass toward Derek. "Not everyone can afford to chase fantasies." I stood by the windows overlooking Dad's prized rose garden, the same garden where he used to walk me when I was scared of these same family gatherings. "You don't have to prove anything to them, Oliver," he'd said when I was 12 and crying about Derek's latest bullying. "Sometimes the quiet ones change everything." The lawyer's entrance cut through the laughter like a blade. Howard Martinez had handled Dad's affairs for 30 years, and today he looked like a man carrying dynamite in a briefcase. The room fell silent as he positioned himself beside the marble fireplace. "Richard Bennett's last will and testament," he announced, unfolding documents that would rewrite everything these people thought they knew about power. Derek lounged in Dad's leather chair like he'd already inherited the kingdom. Patricia adjusted her diamonds. Robert refilled his whiskey. They were all so confident, so entitled, so completely unprepared for what was coming. "First, the real estate holdings," Howard began. "All properties to be donated to the Bennett Family Trust for low-income housing development." Derek's smirk faltered slightly. "Wait, what about the company headquarters?" "Included in the donation." Howard's voice remained steady. "Next, the vehicle collection. All classic cars to be auctioned for charity." The color started draining from Derek's face. Patricia's handkerchief stopped its theatrical dabbing. "The art collection, jewelry, and personal effects," Howard continued, "all donated to various museums and charitable organizations, as specified in the detailed appendix." My Uncle Robert set down his whiskey glass with shaking hands. "This isn't right. Richard always said the company would stay in the family." Howard looked directly at Derek. "The company itself has been transferred to new ownership, effective immediately." Derek shot out of the chair like he'd been electrocuted. "What do you mean, new ownership? I've been running operations for 3 years." "Yes, you have," Howard agreed. "Under a management contract that expired with Mr. Bennett's death. The actual ownership shares were quietly transferred 6 months ago." The room started spinning around them, but I remained perfectly still by the windows, watching their world collapse in real time. "Finally," Howard said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence, "Richard Bennett's personal liquid assets, totaling $48 million, along with his private investment portfolio, valued at approximately $72 million, are left entirely to his son, Oliver Bennett." Patricia gasped so hard she nearly choked. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. The laughter that had echoed through the cemetery was now replaced by the most beautiful silence I'd ever heard. I turned slowly from the windows, meeting each of their shocked faces. "Don't worry," I said, my voice calm as a lake before a storm. "I won't be asking for any loans after all." Derek found his voice first, though it came out as a croak. "This is insane. You didn't even work for the company. You disappeared for 5 years chasing some stupid app ideas?" I finished for him. "You mean the software startup that I built from scratch while you were playing CEO with Dad's money?" The confusion on their faces was almost artistic. "You assumed I failed because I went quiet," I continued, pulling out my phone. A few taps later, the mansion sound system connected to my device. "What you didn't know is that Dad was my first investor. $20,000 when everyone else called me crazy." Derek's face was cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. $20,000 doesn't make you some kind of success story. "You're right," I said, tapping my screen again, "but turning it into a $120 million exit does." The business news article appeared on the wall-mounted display. TechFlow Solutions acquired by Global Systems Inc. for $120 million. Founder Oliver Bennett remains with company as Chief Innovation Officer. Patricia dropped her whiskey glass. The crystal shattered against the marble floor like the sound of their assumptions breaking. "The article went live 3 hours ago," I said, watching Derek's face go through expressions I'd never seen before. "While you were all explaining to the cemetery why I was such a disappointment." Robert's hands were visibly trembling. But the family business, Derek's been running it into the ground?" I pulled up another screen. Dad and I watched the quarterly reports together. 3 years of declining revenue, 2 major client losses, and a bankruptcy filing that Derek somehow forgot to mention. Derek's confident posture collapsed like a house of cards. "How did you—" "Dad shared everything with me," I said. "Every board meeting, every financial decision, every time you spent company money on your personal expenses. We documented it all." What Derek didn't know was that Dad had also given me access to the company's financial systems 2 years earlier, allowing me to track every suspicious transaction and questionable expense report in real time. Howard cleared his throat. "Which brings us to the final element. Mr. Bennett asked me to transfer ownership of Bennett Industries to Oliver effective immediately. Derek, your management contract is terminated." The room felt like it had lost all its oxygen. Derek gripped the back of the chair, his knuckles white. "You can't do this. I've given everything to that company." "You've taken everything from that company," I corrected. "But don't worry, I'm not heartless like you all seem to think." They looked up with desperate hope. "I've already arranged to sell Bennett Industries to a firm that specializes in corporate turnarounds. The sale completes tomorrow morning." I paused, letting that sink in. "None of you will be retained." Patricia found her voice, though it sounded like air leaking from a balloon. "Oliver, please, we're family. We didn't mean—" "You meant every word," I said, walking toward the door. "Every laugh at the funeral, every snide comment about my failures, every time you treated me like I was invisible." I stopped at the threshold and turned back. "The difference is, I learned from Dad not to waste energy on revenge. I built something instead." Derek's voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" I smiled for the first time all day. "The $120 million from my company sale? I didn't keep it. I used it to create the Richard Bennett Foundation for Underestimated Entrepreneurs. It launches next week with a $50 million endowment." The silence stretched like a held breath. "Every year we'll fund 100 young entrepreneurs who've been told they're not good enough, not smart enough, not connected enough. People exactly like me." I looked directly at Derek. "People you would have laughed at." As I walked toward the door, I heard Patricia whisper, "Is he serious about selling the company?" I turned back one last time. "The sale announcement goes public in the morning, but you won't need to worry about finding new jobs." Derek straightened slightly. "Why not?" Because along with the financial records, I'm also releasing documentation of the expense fraud, client manipulation, and fiduciary violations that happened under your management. I pulled out a thick envelope from my jacket. The federal investigators should be in touch soon. The color completely drained from Derek's face. Robert actually swayed on his feet. "You see," I said, reaching for the door handle, "while you were all laughing at funerals, I was learning that the best revenge isn't taking everything away from someone. It's making sure they can never take anything away from anyone else." I stepped outside into the golden afternoon light, leaving behind a room full of people who finally understood what quiet power actually looks like. 6 months later, sitting in my corner office overlooking Silicon Valley, I was featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine with the headline, "The Silent Genius: How One Man Turned Family Rejection into a $200 million Empire." The foundation had already funded its first 50 entrepreneurs, 3 of whom had launched successful companies. The legal consequences for my family played out exactly as I'd anticipated. Derek received a 7-year federal prison sentence for embezzlement and securities fraud. Patricia and Robert both pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received 3 years of probation, though they lost their homes and savings paying for legal representation. Their desperate attempts to reconcile with me stopped completely after the criminal convictions, and we have had no contact since the day of the will reading. But the real victory wasn't their downfall. It was the email I received from a 23-year-old developer in Detroit whose family had called her coding hobby a waste of time. The Bennett Foundation had just funded her AI startup with a $200,000 grant. "Thank you for proving that family isn't always the people who share your blood," she wrote. "Sometimes it's the people who share your vision." As I read those words, I could almost hear Dad's voice in the wind. "Sometimes the quiet ones change everything, Oliver, and sometimes they change everything for everyone." They laughed at me while my father's coffin was being lowered into the ground. But in the end, I had the last laugh, and I made sure it echoed loud enough to lift up everyone they would have tried to silence. Before you go, here's a quick bonus for sticking around. If you love learning and growing like I do, you need to try audiobooks. I've got an exclusive deal with Audible. Your first month is completely free. That's access to over 500,000 titles, 0 cost to you. All the details are waiting in the description. Don't miss this one.